somebody had to wipe the king. Behind the last door of the palace, in a room almost no one could enter, the most powerful man in the kingdom lowered himself onto a velvet seat, and another man knelt to hold the basin and help him clean. No guards, no bishops, no wife. And there, stripped of his crown, the king talked freely of his fears, his enemies, his failing marriage, because the man at his feet was the one person in the kingdom he trusted never to repeat it. This man was the groom of the stool, and he was not the lowest servant at court. He was, again and again, one of the most powerful men in it, a post the greatest families in the land bribed and schemed to win. This is the story of where it came from, how the filthiest task in the palace became one of the most powerful, and how in the end it died, not in scandal, but the day a king finally wanted to be alone. The job is almost as old as the monarchy itself. The moment a ruler shut himself away behind guarded doors, a single problem followed him inside. Someone still had to tend his body, to dress it, wash it, and deal with what it did in private. That servant saw the king as no one else ever would. And over, in court after court, that servant turned into a power. The Roman Empire made it an office. By the 4th century, the emperors in Constantinople were served in the bedchamber by the praepositus sacri cubiculi, the Grand Chamberlain, who ran a staff of body servants and controlled who could reach the throne. The men chosen were almost always eunuchs, men who could never father a dynasty or claim the throne themselves, and so posed no threat to the emperor they served. One of them, a eunuch named Eutropius, began as a slave and rose from the bedchamber to rule the entire Eastern Roman Empire, and in the year 399 had himself made consul, Rome's highest honor, never before given to a eunuch. The man who dressed the emperor now governed his empire. France turned the same truth into an open theatre. At Versailles, Louis XIV made his own body a ceremony of state. Each morning, at the lever, the king's rising, a crowd of noblemen filled his bedchamber to watch him wake, wash, and dress. The honor of handing the king his shirt went to the highest-ranking man in the room, and princes of the blood took it when they were present. And the ritual reached all the way to the chaise percée, the king's velvet commode, where the king received his court while he sat, a privilege that had to be bought. Noblemen paid the crown 60,000 écus, sometimes 100,000, for the brevet de fer, the written right to be present at that most private moment. Even the servant who brought the commode in and carried the chamber pot away, the porte-chaise d'affaires, was no menial. He was a gentleman of the court, sword at his side, who had paid 20,000 livres to the crown for the office. In France, every hand that came near the king's body, however filthy the task, belonged to a nobleman, and each of those hands had paid for the privilege. England did something no other court did. It shut the door. In Rome, the work was spread across a department of eunuchs. In France, it was a public ceremony shared out among competing noblemen. Only the English gave it to one man alone, behind a locked chamber door, under a single blunt title, the Groom of the Stool. He did the lowest work with his own hands and rose, on the strength of it, to the top of the court. And because it was a formal office, it left a trail: wages, warrants, wills, and one man's execution that lets us follow, in close detail, exactly what such a servant could become. The role was older than the Tudors. There was already a yeoman of the stool at the court of Henry VI as early as 1455. But it was Henry VII who gave it its final shape. He sealed off the private royal apartments, the privy chamber, and set behind their final door the close stool, the padded box that served as the royal toilet. And in a written order of 1497, he gave the man who tended him there the title by which the office would be known for the next 400 years, our Groom of the Stool. That first-named holder was Hugh Dennis. The 1497 order survives, listing his supplies: black velvet, silk fringe, 2 pewter basins. Dennis was no scullion, but a gentleman of good family, and before long he was handling the king's secret money. He died holding the manors across the country. All of it had grown from a single piece of furniture, and nothing about that furniture was humble. It was no crude bucket. It was a padded box at sitting height, upholstered in black velvet, trimmed with silk and studded to keep the covering in place. A pewter basin set beneath the seat, the whole of it built to travel wherever the king went. 2 centuries later, kings were still using them. One royal example, belonging to William III, survives at Hampton Court to this day, upholstered in crimson velvet like a small throne. There is the whole paradox in a single object. The richest man in the kingdom emptied his bowels onto a seat as fine as his coronation chair, and a nobleman's son knelt at the side of it. And the work was exactly as bodily as it sounds. The groom loosened the king from his heavy layers, held the basin, passed the cloth, and cleaned him. Then came the part no one likes to picture. He examined what the king left behind, its colour, its firmness, and carried word of it to the royal physicians. A king's bowels were not a private matter. They were a daily bulletin on the health of the crown itself, and the man who read that bulletin first every morning was the man on his knees. This was not closeness as a figure of speech. It was closeness with nothing left to hide. One man at the worst and most defenceless moment of another man's day, every day for years. A king on the close stool is a king with no armour, no crown, no guards, no audience, only a man at his most exposed, and the one servant who saw him that way each morning. You cannot kneel at another man's body day after day and remain a stranger to him. And an unguarded king talks, he grumbles, he confides, he lets slip what he would never say to a minister. And the groom heard all of it and repeated none of it. That silence was the foundation of everything that followed, because the man closest to the king became the gate to the king. No one reached the royal presence without passing him, so it was the groom who decided who was let in and who was left waiting in the cold, and a courtier who wanted the king's ear learned to win the groom's first. Ambassadors bribed him, great men flattered him, and the crown placed its private fortune in his hands. The privy purse, the king's own money, spent and kept far from the eyes of the treasury. On the household books, his formal wage was modest, the pay of a household servant. It did not matter. The true fortune came from land, gifts and offices the king pressed on the one man he trusted with his own body, and even from the king's cast-offs, robes of silk and cloth of gold worth more than most lords could buy new. That power made the office a prize, and the men who held it the most envied at court. Henry VIII kept his privy chamber full of young favourites, clever and athletic, who dressed him and held his secrets and controlled the door to him. The old nobility sneered at them as minions, upstarts with the king's ear who had not earned it. One man resented them above all others, Cardinal Wolsey, the most powerful minister in England, who could govern the whole realm and still not reach the king in the one room that mattered. So in January 1526, Wolsey struck, under cover of thrift and good order, clearing out, as the rules put it, sickly and unfit persons from the court. He pushed through a sweeping set of household regulations, the Eltham Ordinances, whose real target was the intimate circle around the king. They cut the gentlemen of the privy chamber from 12 to 6. they set down in writing exactly who was permitted to lay hands on the royal body and who was not. And they bound every man of that chamber to secrecy, to keep close all that was said or done within it, on pain of dismissal, because Wolsey understood that the secrets traded in that room were themselves a form of power. The second most powerful man in England rewrote the rules of the entire royal household in order to cage a handful of servants whose only weapon was that they knelt closest to the king. And it did not even work. Within 3 years, Wolsey had fallen, disgraced and broken, and the servants of the body were still there, still kneeling, still listening. The stool had outlasted the cardinal. That power did not just survive attack. It remade the men who carried it. Sir William Compton was groom to Henry VIII from 1509, when the king was a boy of 18 and Compton barely older, less a servant than a friend who happened to kneel at the stool. He handled the young king's secrets and his pleasures, and Henry rewarded him as kings reward the men they trust with everything, with land, offices and cash, until Compton was drawing close to £2,000 a year, the income of a great lord, all of it grown out of one private room. Compton died of the sweating sickness in 1528, one of the richest men the king had ever raised from nothing. Compton's successor, Sir Henry Norris, took the office in 1526, and the keepership of the privy purse with it. No man stood closer to Henry or knew him better, and in the end that was precisely the danger. In May 1536, when Anne Boleyn was brought down, Norris was named among the men accused of being her lovers, on evidence that convinced almost no one. His true crime was not adultery. It was standing too close to a king who had turned dangerous. He was beheaded on Tower Hill. The intimacy that had lifted him was the very thing that laid his head on the block. The office passed next to Sir Thomas Heneage, who held it through the turbulent middle years, from 1536 to 1546, and who shows how deep into the king it was allowed to see. When Henry married Anne of Cleves in 1540 and could not bring himself to touch her, it was to the men who served him in private, Heneage among them, that he confided why, complaining that her body was not that of a maid, that her breasts hung so slack. A royal marriage failed, and the most intimate evidence of it passed first through the hands of the servant at the stool. That was the real treasure of the office, not gold, but knowledge no one else was permitted to hold. Its last holder under Henry, Sir Anthony Denny, brought the office to its summit. By the mid-1540s, Henry was vast, sick and dying, and Denny commanded the door to him, who reached the king and who did not. He held the dry stamp, a plate that pressed Henry's signature onto paper, so the will of the king could be issued without the king lifting a hand, a fearsome thing in the grip of the man who chose when to use it. He helped draft the royal will itself. And on the 27th of January, 1547, it fell to Denny to do the one thing no courtier dared, to tell Henry VIII to his face that he was dying and should make his peace with God. The king died the next day. The man whose office had begun at the close stool now stood at the very centre of who would rule England next. In a single lifetime, the job had travelled from wiping a boy king to settling the fate of the crown. The office did not fall. It faded, slowly, across 3 centuries, until nothing of the original remained. The first crack came with a child. When Henry's 9-year-old son took the throne as Edward VI in 1547, Sir Michael Stanhope became the last man recorded performing the office's full bodily service. But around a boy king, the role turned into something else, a lever in other men's hands. Sir John Gates used his place in the Privy Chamber to control who reached the child, on behalf of the Duke of Northumberland, who ruled in the boy's name. Then came Henry's daughters, and the whole thing broke on a simple fact. No man could kneel at the private body of a queen. Under Mary and then Elizabeth, the duties passed to women of the bedchamber. For Elizabeth, above all, to her old governess Catherine Ashley, closer to the Queen than any man at court. And the great male office that had shaped the Tudor court went quiet. The Stuarts revived it, but the life had drained out. Even the name slipped loose from its meaning. As the old work was forgotten, Groom of the Stool drifted into Groom of the Stole, reshaped after the Latin word for a robe, until an office borne at a commode was taken to be about the king's wardrobe. It became a grand, empty honour handed to the greatest men in the land, none of whom went anywhere near a close stool. One of them, John Stuart, Earl of Bute, held the office in George III's household and rode that closeness all the way to Downing Street. He became in 1762 Prime Minister of Great Britain, and remains one of the most despised men ever to hold the post. Hated as a royal favourite, hated for being Scottish, hated for having reached the top through nearness to the king rather than merit. He was pelted in the streets and burned in effigy by mobs, and resigned within a year. So it drifted on, splendid and empty, an office attached to a job that no longer existed, until at last a king ended it. The last man ever to hold the title was James Hamilton, 2nd Duke of Abercorn, Groom of the Stole to the Prince of Wales, from 1886 to 1891. He never went near a close stool in his life. When that same prince came to the throne in 1901 as Edward VII, he abolished the post outright, and no one has held it since. The crown had finally sealed itself off. The king, at last, wanted to be alone.